Her card was declined. The line behind her grew restless, just when shame burned her cheeks. A stranger stepped forward and quietly said, "Let me get this." What followed wasn't just kindness. It was the beginning of a story that would change 3 lives forever. Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories. The rain tapped steadily against the wide front windows of the grocery store, a gray curtain blurring the world outside. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed faintly as the checkout line inched forward. When it was finally her turn, Emily Thompson placed her groceries on the conveyor belt with practiced grace. But the moment she slid her card through the reader, the machine beeped with a sharp finality. Declined. Her stomach tightened. She tried again, forcing a polite smile, hoping it was just a glitch. Declined. A third attempt? Her cheeks now warm with embarrassment. The line behind her growing restless, a sigh drifted from somewhere in the crowd, followed by the shuffle of impatient feet. Emily fumbled through her designer purse, fingers brushing against cards she had barely touched since her divorce. She could feel eyes pressing into her back, strangers silently measuring her, a woman who looked perfectly put together, yet couldn't pay for a few simple bags of groceries. She opened her mouth to apologize, to say something, anything. When a quiet voice rose from behind her, "Let me get this," the man said gently. Emily turned, startled, and met a pair of steady, kind eyes. He wasn't dressed in the tailored suit she was used to seeing in her world, just a man in jeans and a worn jacket, his little girl peeking out shyly from behind his legs, clutching a small stuffed elephant. The girl's wide eyes held the sort of innocent curiosity that made Emily's throat tighten. "Oh, I couldn't possibly," she stammered, instinctively pulling back. But he was already sliding his card into the machine with a calm ease, nodding to the cashier. "It happens to everyone," he said with a small smile, as if they were old friends sharing a secret. "Just pay it forward sometime." The words were so simple, so unadorned, and yet they landed with surprising weight. She wanted to thank him properly, to explain that she wasn't careless or irresponsible, that her mind had simply been elsewhere. But before she could gather herself, he and the little girl were already moving toward the door. The bell above it jingled softly, and in another breath, they were swallowed by the rain. Emily stood still, her groceries now neatly bagged, the cashier giving her a knowing smile. "That's just Michael," the woman said as she handed over the bags, always looking out for others. Emily murmured a faint thank you, though she wasn't sure if it was for the groceries, the kindness, or the way that single moment had pierced through her carefully constructed armor. Outside, the rain poured hard, washing the sidewalks clean. But she remained rooted for a beat longer, hearing his voice echo in her mind. Pay it forward. It was such a small gesture, yet something about it lingered. She didn't know his story, or why he had stepped in so quickly without hesitation. But she knew one thing with quiet certainty. This wouldn't be the last time she thought about Michael Davis, and the gentle way he had appeared, then vanished on a rainy Portland evening. The rain followed him home that night, drumming softly against the windows of a modest second-floor apartment on the east side of Portland. Inside, the space was quiet, warm in its own snug way. Though small and a little worn, the plumbing rattled when the heat kicked on. The kitchen cabinets creaked when opened, but for Michael Davis, it was home, it was steady, and steady was what his daughter needed most. 7-year-old Sophie padded sleepily into the kitchen, still holding the stuffed elephant she had carried since the funeral. Her hair was tangled from dreams, her eyes heavy yet bright as she looked at him. "Morning, Daddy," she whispered, though it was barely sunrise. Michael's entire face softened at the sound. "Morning. Sunshine. Pancakes today?" She nodded eagerly, sliding into her chair. The elephant perched beside her like an old friend as he whisked the baton. Michael let his eyes drift for a moment toward the silver frame propped on the counter. Laura's smile beamed back at him from that photo. Forever frozen in the spring before the diagnosis. 3 years gone, and still some mornings. His hand reached instinctively across the bed, expecting to find her there. He breathed in slowly, steadying himself before flipping the pancakes and setting them on Sophie's plate. Cut diagonally, just the way she liked. The refrigerator behind him told another story, covered in colorful drawings, rainbows, stick figure families, a cat that looked more like a cloud with legs. It was a gallery of Sophie's childhood. Above those pictures sat a row of neatly stacked architecture magazines, a small indulgence from a life he had left behind. Once upon a time, he had stayed up all night drafting blueprints for gleaming towers and innovative community spaces. He had been part of the Horizon Plaza team, a project praised across the country for its sustainable design back then. His name had begun to mean something in the world of architecture. But when Laura got sick, deadlines and accolades no longer mattered. His firm had been supportive at first. Remote work, flexible leave, but caring for her became all-consuming. And when she was gone, Sophie needed more than a father with his head buried in drawings. She needed someone present. So, he made a clean break. The job at Parkside Market wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable, predictable, and close to Sophie's school. Managing shifts, balancing inventory, solving small crises. It wasn't designing skylines, but it gave him mornings like this. It gave him the gift of walking Sophie to class, of reading bedtime stories without rushing through them, of simply being there. As Sophie chattered between bites of pancake about career day at school, Michael listened, nodding, laughing when she smeared syrup across her cheek. "Mrs. Watson was going to come talk about being a nurse," she said, swinging her legs. "But I want you to come instead. You can tell everyone about the store." He hesitated. Thursday was usually his busiest shift, but he caught the sparkle in her eyes, the hope there, and quietly decided he would swap shifts for her. When she skipped off to brush her teeth, Michael picked up one of the old magazines and thumbed through the glossy pages. Images of glass towers and bold urban landscapes stared back at him. A pang stirred in his chest. Architecture had been his dream, the blueprint of the life he once imagined. But Sophie was his life now, the one structure he refused to let crumble. Some sacrifices felt less like loss and more like love. As he rinsed the dishes and packed her lunch, the memory of the woman from the grocery store flickered briefly in his mind. The way she had flushed with embarrassment, the way her composure cracked before she could catch it. He hadn't thought much of it then. Helping her was instinct. But as he zipped Sophie's backpack and helped her into her jacket, a quiet thought settled in the back of his mind. Sometimes the smallest gestures, like paying for groceries in the rain, had a way of building foundations you couldn't yet see. Across town, while Michael buttoned Sophie's jacket and tied her shoelaces, another morning was beginning with a very different rhythm. The glass walls of Thompson Innovations towered over Portland's skyline, sharp lines gleaming in the pale light. Inside, Emily Thompson walked briskly through the lobby, heels striking against the marble floor. Employees parting quietly as she passed. To most, she was the embodiment of success. A 36-year-old CEO who had built her company into one of the most respected names in architectural technology. To Emily, it felt more like walking through a shell. Her corner office stretched wide, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of the city. Once that view had filled her with fire, a sense of wonder at what was possible. Now it only reminded her how far away she felt from the people who actually lived in the buildings her company designed. She set her leather briefcase on the desk, opened her tablet, and skimmed the notes for the board meeting. Numbers, projections, forecasts, profitable, efficient, sterile. The Hearthlight project had been meant to change that. Affordable, sustainable housing for families who needed more than concrete walls. For neighborhoods that deserved spaces to breathe and grow. She had envisioned gardens, study areas, community kitchens, designs that gave back more than they took. But as deadlines stretched and costs crept higher, the board grew restless. To them, Hearthlight was a line item, a risk to be trimmed and polished until it resembled any other development. Emily's assistant appeared in the doorway. "The board is waiting," she nodded, smoothing the fabric of her blazer, and followed him into the conference room. Around the long table sat men and women in tailored suits, their eyes fixed on spreadsheets rather than blueprints. She presented the latest updates with crisp authority, her voice steady even as she felt that familiar hollowness beneath each polished sentence. When she emphasized the community elements, the gardens, the family spaces, Robert Jenkins, the oldest and most traditional of the board, leaned forward with a tight smile. "Perhaps it's time to scale back," he suggested. "Scrap the extras. Focus on the commercial aspects. Our shareholders expect returns, not social experiment." The words struck harder than they should have. Emily steadied her breath. "The community elements are the entire point," she countered, sharper than intended. "We're not just building structures. We're creating places where people can actually live." Robert's smile widened. Condescending. Noble sentiments. But noble doesn't pay dividends. A few members chuckled softly. Emily kept her posture straight. But inside, a quiet ache deepened. When the meeting ended, she returned to her office and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment as silence wrapped around her. From the top drawer of her desk, she pulled out a small piece of paper, its edges crumpled, colors faded. A child's drawing, rainbows arched across the page, a crooked house in the corner, stick figures smiling in the grass. It had been given to her at a community event years ago, before the company had grown so large, before she had learned to measure every dream against a balance sheet. Her phone buzzed with another alert. Legal papers finalizing her divorce. James had once called her brilliant, unstoppable, unreachable. She had been too busy chasing success to notice how the connection had slipped away. Now even her passion projects seemed to be slipping, strangled by numbers and timelines. Emily set the drawing carefully on her desk, staring at the uneven rainbow. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to wonder if she had lost sight of the very thing she had once promised herself never to forget. And somewhere in that reflection, the memory of the man from the grocery store flickered unexpectedly, the quiet strength in his eyes. The way he had acted without hesitation, without needing anything in return. She didn't even know his name yet. But something about that encounter lingered, tugging at her, whispering that maybe not everything in her world had to be reduced to profit and loss. 3 days later, Emily found herself standing in the parking lot of Parkside Market, staring at the familiar green awning as if it might give her courage. It was ridiculous, she told herself. CEOs didn't chase down strangers who happened to do a good deed in a grocery line, but something about that moment in the rain had unsettled her, tugging at her with quiet persistence. She had been called brilliant, unreachable, untouchable. And yet, a man in worn jeans and kind eyes had seen her flustered and human, and treated her with simple compassion. She needed to know why that mattered so much. Inside, the store was busy with the usual weekend rush. Families moved between aisles. Children tugged at cereal boxes. And the hum of conversation mixed with the steady beep of scanners. Emily felt out of place in her tailored navy suit, heels clicking against the linoleum as she tried to appear casual. She wandered past displays of apples and bread, glancing discreetly into each section until she finally spotted him. Michael was in produce, wearing a green apron over a button-down shirt, his name badge pinned neatly to his chest. He was helping an elderly woman reach a box of tea from the top shelf. Crouching slightly so she could steady herself against his shoulder, the exchange was gentle, unhurried, his voice low and kind. Something in the way he moved struck her. It wasn't the hurried efficiency of an employee simply doing his job. It was steadiness, a quiet authority, as though he carried a knowledge larger than the space he occupied. She lingered near the avocados, pretending to compare ripeness while stealing glances. His profile stirred a sense of familiarity she couldn't place. When a young employee approached him with a question about the inventory system, Michael leaned in, patient, explaining step by step with the ease of a teacher. Emily felt a spark of recognition then, not of his face, but of the way he carried himself. She had seen that kind of clarity before, in architects presenting models of buildings that hadn't yet come to life. Curiosity pulled her closer to the customer service desk. "Excuse me," she said casually to the manager, gesturing toward Michael, the man in produce. "He seems very capable." The manager beamed. "Michael, he's the best we've got. Overqualified." Honestly, used to be an architect with Morgan and Bray before family circumstances changed. Their loss, our gain. Emily nearly dropped the basket in her hands. Morgan and Bray. Her breath caught, memories flashing back to her early years of study when she had devoured every article on Horizon Plaza, a project that redefined sustainable design. She had used it as a case study, citing its community integration as proof that architecture could serve more than profit. If Michael Davis had been part of that team, then he wasn't just a kind stranger. He was a talent hidden in plain sight. A man who had once shaped the very project that had inspired her to build Thompson Innovations. As she paid for a token purchase, her mind raced. The Hearthlight project was slipping away, threatened by voices that saw only numbers. But here was someone who knew not only how to design buildings, but how to anchor them in the lives of real people. Perhaps it wasn't a coincidence that their paths had crossed. Perhaps this man was the missing piece she hadn't realized she was searching for. Walking back into the cool Portland air, Emily tightened her grip on the paper bag in her hands. For the first time in months, an unfamiliar feeling stirred in her chest. Hope. The vacant lot stretched wide beneath the pale Saturday sun, its edges lined with cracked sidewalks and a scattering of weeds that had pushed stubbornly through broken concrete. Once this space had been dismissed as forgotten ground. Now, with volunteers kneeling in dirt and children laughing as they tugged at tangled roots, it carried the stirrings of something new. Thompson Innovations had purchased the land for the Hearthlight Project's community center, and each month a cleanup day was held to build neighborhood pride. Usually, Emily sent her assistant with branded t-shirts and snacks. But today, she came herself. Jeans, a simple blouse, hair pulled into a loose ponytail, no title, no boardroom, just another pair of hands. She slipped on gardening gloves and knelt beside a flower bed, pulling weeds with more determination than skill. Dirt smudged her cheek and a lock of hair fell against her face, and she found herself oddly grateful for the imperfection of it. This was the work that reminded her why she had started. A familiar voice drifted across the lot. "Careful with those seedlings." Sophie. "They're just babies." Emily turned, her breath catching. A few yards away, Michael knelt in the soil, his green apron replaced by a worn gray t-shirt. Beside him, a little girl, Sophie, pressed her small hands into the earth, patting the dirt around a tomato plant with quiet pride. Her face was streaked with soil, her smile wide and unrestrained. The sight held Emily motionless for a moment, as though she had stumbled into a memory she didn't know she needed. She walked closer, hesitant, her gloves still clinging to weeds. "Hello again," she said softly. Michael looked up, confusion passing across his features before recognition settled in. His smile was small, reserved, but warm. "Grocery lady?" he said. "Emily," she offered, her voice gentler than she intended. "I never properly thanked you." "No thanks necessary," he replied, nodding toward the garden around them. "Didn't expect to see you here. I work in construction," she said lightly, the half-truth rolling easier than it should. "This project caught my interest." Sophie tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, can I plant the purple flowers now?" "Sure." "Remember what I showed you," he said. Turning back to his daughter with patient encouragement, Emily knelt beside them, her eyes on the small cluster of seedlings in Sophie's hand. "I like your rainbow," she told the girl, remembering the drawing she had seen at the market. Sophie's eyes lit up. "I have better ones. I'm taking an art class on Saturdays now," Michael chuckled, watching the exchange. "She's becoming a Renaissance woman, gardening and art." Sophie giggled, clearly unsure what that meant, but pleased all the same. As they worked side by side, Emily found herself asking questions she hadn't asked anyone in months. "What do you think this neighborhood needs most?" Michael pressed the soil gently around a new plant, his gaze sweeping the lot. "More than pretty landscaping. Families here need real support. A community kitchen for parents working 2 jobs. Laundry rooms so mothers don't spend hours on buses. Study areas for kids who don't have space at home. If this place is going to matter, it has to live with them, not just look nice from the outside." The words settled over her like a quiet revelation. Not buzzwords, not projection, just lived truth spoken with steady conviction. Emily felt something stir deep inside, the same spark that had driven her years ago, before profits and timelines dulled her edges. The site coordinator called for lunch and volunteers began gathering. Michael dusted his hands, offering her thermos tea, nothing fancy, green with mint. She accepted, touched more than she could admit by the simple gesture, sitting beside him on the edge of a planter. Watching Sophie carefully line up her flowers, Emily realized with sudden clarity, this man wasn't just a chance encounter, he was the missing piece her project had been waiting for, and perhaps, just perhaps, the piece her heart had been waiting for. 2 weeks later, Michael was called into the front office at Parkside Market, wiping his hands on a folded notepad he carried in his apron pocket. The district manager stood waiting with a visitor. To Michael's surprise, it was her, Emily. But today she wore a professional calmness, a blazer in place of the casual blouse from the garden. "Michael," the manager said proudly, "this is Ms. Thompson, a consultant specializing in sustainable practices. She'll be working with us on possible redesigns. I'd like you to show her around. Given your background, you're the best person for it." Michael froze for a beat, suspicion flickering in his eyes. Twice in 1 month seemed too much to be a coincidence. Still, he nodded politely. "All right, let's start with refrigeration." They moved through the store together, weaving between shelves and customers. Michael explained how the older systems wasted energy, how the lighting drained more power than necessary. Emily listened carefully, asking questions that revealed she understood far more than a casual consultant should. She wasn't just nodding along. She was engaging, challenging, pushing him to expand his thoughts. In the back room beside humming compressors, Michael sketched a quick diagram on scrap paper. "If we reroute here, cut inefficiencies in this loop, we could reduce usage by 15%. Emily leaned closer, watching the pencil glide across the page. "That's not just cost saving," she murmured. "That's design thinking. For the first time in years, Michael felt a flicker of the old spark, his mind turning over possibilities, his hand moving almost faster than he could explain. He drew arrows, circled weak points, and imagined new flows of space and light. And she didn't just follow, she kept pace. She pushed him to clarify, to explain why certain choices mattered, her questions sharp but respectful. Later, they sat in the break room, stacks of paper spread between them. Michael flipped open an old notebook, one he hadn't shown anyone since leaving the firm. Inside were rough sketches, fragments of designs that had lived only in his imagination. He hesitated, then slid it toward her. They're nothing recent, just old habits. Emily studied the lines with quiet attention. These are more than habits, she said softly. They're vision. Her words lodged in him, deeper than he expected. For so long, his identity had been reduced to grocery schedules and inventory charts. Hearing someone see him as more than that unsettled him, but in a way that felt like breathing after years underwater. Over the following days, she returned again and again, always with questions or new diagrams to review. Sometimes Sophie would join them after school, plopping into a chair beside her father, coloring quietly, while Michael explained design concept. To his surprise, Emily seemed to welcome the interruptions, asking Sophie's opinion on which shelves should be lower or whether the break room needed brighter light. Sophie answered with the blunt wisdom only children carried, and both adults laughed more than they expected. Piece by piece, Michael began sketching again. First small corrections, then full redesign. He spoke about airflow, about creating spaces that served more than efficiency, about designs that breathed with people's lives. And Emily, always listening, always nudging, became part of the rhythm. One evening, as they rolled up the last drawings on the table, Michael paused, pencil still in his hand. Funny, he said quietly. I thought that part of me was gone. Emily met his gaze. It was never gone. It was waiting for the right reason to return. For a long moment, silence hung between them, warm and steady, like the foundation of something neither had planned, but both were beginning to need. One evening, after weeks of sketches passed between the break room and late afternoons at the market, Emily found herself standing at the door of Michael's apartment. He opened it with a slightly embarrassed smile, as though inviting her into his private world felt far more vulnerable than showing her blueprints. The place was modest, 2 bedrooms, walls that carried the faint echo of old pipes, but it was alive in a way most glossy condos could never be. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator, bright rainbows and crooked houses layered like a story told in crayon. A shelf in the corner held rows of architecture books, their spines worn from years of use. And on the coffee table, Sophie's art supplies spilled across sketch pads, her laughter filling the room as she showed Emily her newest creation, a sunflower with a smiley face. Daddy says sunflowers always turn toward the light, Sophie explained proudly. Michael's gaze softened as he kissed the top of her head. That's right, even on cloudy days. They look for the sun. When Sophie eventually drifted to sleep on the couch, her stuffed elephant tucked under her chin, Michael disappeared briefly into the closet. He returned with a leather portfolio, edges scuffed from travel, and placed it on the table between them. His fingers lingered on the clasp. Hesitant, it's been years since anyone's seen these. Emily leaned forward as he opened it. Page after page revealed careful renderings, community centers, housing development, sketches that blended elegance with function. One series made her breath catch, preliminary drawings of Horizon Plaza, the project that had once fueled her own passion. You worked on Horizon, she whispered, awe slipping into her voice. Michael nodded, eyes distant. Lead designer for the community integration pieces. The gardens, the study halls, the parts most people walk past without noticing. I noticed, she said quietly. That project changed everything for me. It showed me buildings could hold soul. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the portfolio open like a bridge between their worlds. Finally, she asked the question that had been pressing at her since the first time she heard his name. What happened? Michael, how does someone with this kind of vision end up here? He exhaled, leaning back in his chair. My wife Laura was diagnosed with aggressive cancer 5 years ago. At first, the firm tried to accommodate me. Remote options, flexible hours. But the reality of caregiving doesn't fit into neat boxes. Every day was unpredictable. I couldn't balance deadlines with hospital visits. Eventually, I walked away. His hand brushed over one of the drawings, tracing a line as though it were a scar. After she passed, Sophie needed something I could actually give her. Stability, a routine, not a father who disappeared into midnight meetings and endless revisions. Emily's throat tightened. She wanted to speak. But his voice carried its own quiet strength. Architecture was my dream, he said, eyes fixed on the portfolio. Then he glanced toward the sleeping child on the couch. But Sophie is my life. Do I regret the career change sometimes? Yes. Do I regret the reason? Never. I'd make the same choice again. The words settled, heavy and luminous in the small room. Emily felt her own walls shift, her polished CEO armor giving way to something tender in the stillness. With sketches of buildings between them and a sleeping child nearby, she realized she wasn't just witnessing a man's lost career, she was witnessing a love story, one drawn in sacrifice, anchored in devotion, and still somehow open to beginnings he had never planned for. The night before the board meeting, the weight of silence pressed heavily in Emily's office. She had just hung up the phone with her assistant. An emergency session had been called. The Hearthlight project was on the brink of collapse. Robert Jenkins and his allies were pushing hard to gut the community elements, to strip away the very heart of what she'd fought for. She knew she needed help, but the only person whose vision could make the project breathe again didn't even know who she really was. When Michael arrived at her apartment later that evening, portfolio still in his hands from their last conversation, she drew a long breath. "There's something I haven't told you," she began. Voice low, fragile. He tilted his head, waiting. "I'm not just a consultant," she confessed. "I'm the CEO of Thompson Innovations. The Hearthlight project is mine, my company's, and tomorrow I need your help to save it." The silence that followed felt like a crack in the earth. Michael's face hardened, his eyes searching hers as though the ground had shifted beneath him. "So, all this time you've been lying to me." "I wasn't lying," she said quickly. You let me believe you were some consultant tagging along for notes. Do you have any idea how humiliating that feels? Was this a game to you? Some kind of corporate charity case?" His voice was steady, but the disappointment behind it cut sharper than anger. "No," she whispered, fighting the urge to reach for him. "It wasn't that. At first, I didn't want my title to change the way you spoke to me. And then I was afraid. Afraid if you knew, you'd stop seeing me the way you do now. Not as a CEO, just as me." Michael's jaw tightened. He looked down at the drawings spread across the table, his hands curling into fists. "Professional consultants get contracts, Emily. They get credit. They get honesty. Did you think I wouldn't work with you if you told me the truth?" She couldn't answer, and in the silence, she saw the trust between them fracture. Still, when the morning sun rose in the boardroom filled with sharp suits and sharper agendas, Michael was there. He sat quietly at the back as Emily presented the revised community center design. Her voice firm, but the atmosphere heavy with resistance. Robert leaned forward, lips curling into a practiced smile. "Mrs. Thompson, while your sentiment is admirable, the numbers don't lie. This direction increases cost by 20 cents and pushes the timeline 6 months behind. I propose we redirect funds to a more profitable commercial project downtown." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Emily's pulse quickened. She glanced toward the visitors' row where Michael sat, arms folded, expression unreadable. She had asked him to come, not knowing if he would, taking a breath. She turned back to the board. "Before you vote, I'd like to introduce someone. Michael Davis, former lead designer at Morgan & Bray. He was part of the Horizon Plaza team. He's reviewed our designs, and he has something to say." Chairs shifted, eyebrows lifted. Robert himself straightened, clearly surprised. Michael rose slowly, walked to the screen, and with calm authority began pulling up renderings she hadn't seen before. He must have worked through the night. "The community focus doesn't have to mean runaway costs," he said evenly. "By reorienting key spaces, combining functions, and phasing construction, we can cut expenses by 15% while actually increasing livability." He pointed to laundry facilities integrated with study spaces, 2 kitchens doubling as vocational training hubs, to playgrounds designed beside seating for parents working long hours. His words carried not just technical knowledge but lived experience. "I know these ideas work," he said, "because I see the needs every day. I live among them." The room shifted. A working mother on the board leaned forward, intrigued. The financial director began scribbling notes. Support that had wavered began tilting back toward Hearthlight. Robert tried to interject, but the tide had turned. By the end of the session, the board voted to move forward with Michael's revisions. The community core remained intact as members filed out. Emily caught Michael's eye. Gratitude welled up inside her. But when she whispered, "You saved it," he only replied quietly, I did it for them, not for you. And with that, he gathered his portfolio and walked away, leaving her with both victory and a hollow ache she hadn't anticipated. A week passed after the board meeting, and the victory of Hearthlight still rang hollow for Emily. She had saved the project, yes, but at the cost of Michael's trust. His words lingered like an ache. I did it for them, not for you. She threw herself into revisions with her team, bearing the sting under schedules and budgets. Yet in the quiet moments, she missed the sound of his voice sketching out ideas. The warmth of tea shared from a thermos, the way Sophie's laughter softened his tired edges. When Michael finally walked into her office unannounced, she nearly spilled her coffee. He stood in the doorway, more formally dressed than she had ever seen him, a folder in his hand. His expression was steady, but not unkind. If you're still interested in having me consult on Hearthlight, he said, placing the folder on her desk. These are my terms. Clear contract, proper credit, flexible hours so I can be there for Sophie. Emily scanned the pages. Fair, professional, without the warmth that had once marked their conversations. She looked up, her voice soft. These are more than acceptable. I should have offered this from the start. I owe you an apology, Michael, for not being honest, for not trusting that you'd see me, even with the title. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Transparency matters. If we're going to work together, it has to be real. Just as he turned to leave, he hesitated. There's one more thing. Tomorrow is career day at Sophie's school. She asked if you would come with me. Emily blinked, caught off guard. Me. Why? He almost smiled. Because in her words, Daddy builds pretty things and Miss Emily makes them real. His eyes softened just a little. You've made an impression. The next morning, Michael looked slightly uncomfortable in a suit that didn't quite fit his broad shoulders while Sophie bounced beside him, fussing with his tie. When Emily arrived at the classroom, Sophie darted forward with uncontained delight. You came? Now Daddy won't be nervous. The presentation was nothing like a boardroom pitch. Michael spoke simply about how buildings tell stories, how spaces shape the way people live and feel. He held up small models, letting the children touch them, explaining how walls carry weight, and how light changes a room. His voice was steady, his pride quiet but unmistakable. When he introduced Emily, his words caught her by surprise. This is Miss Thompson. She helps make buildings better for people and for the planet. Emily followed his lead, crouching to the children's level, telling them how buildings could be like trees, giving more than they take. She used crayons and paper to let them design their own dream spaces. The classroom filled with chatter and color, a chorus of unfiltered imagination. At one point, a boy raised his hand and asked boldly, "Is Miss Emily your girlfriend, Mr. Davis?" Laughter erupted, cheeks flushed, and Michael cleared his throat. She's my colleague. We work together on important projects, but the children giggled loud, unconvinced. Sophie, with all the seriousness of 7 years, stood up and announced, they're Lego friends. They build things together. That's what matters. The room cheered, and Michael and Emily exchanged a glance that said more than either could in words. Later, walking down the hallway as Sophie ran ahead toward the playground, Emily whispered, "She's proud of you." Michael, you gave those kids a glimpse of something real today. He loosened his tie with a sigh, a small smile tugging at his mouth. It felt good to be architect dad again, not just grocery store dad. Emily touched his arm gently. You never stopped being an architect. It's who you are. And maybe it's time the world remembered that. In the soft hum of a school hallway, with children's laughter spilling in from the playground, something fragile but certain shifted between them. Not a promise. Not yet. But a beginning built not from titles or facades, but from honesty, trust, and the quiet belief that some foundations once laid could carry more than they ever imagined. 1 month later, the vacant lot that once seemed forgotten had transformed into something alive. The Hearthlight Community Garden bloomed with rows of vegetables, splashes of wildflowers and the hum of neighbors who now came regularly to tend the soil. Children played on the edges, volunteers painted benches, and in the center, Michael knelt beside a small stone basin, tightening the final piece of a fountain he and Sophie had designed together. Emily stood nearby, holding a bucket of water while Sophie carefully poured it in. The stream trickled, then flowed, the sound soft and steady like a heartbeat. Sophie clapped her hands, dirt smudged across her cheeks. It works. Daddy, Miss Emily. Come look. Michael straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. and met Emily's gaze. There was no boardroom between them, no hidden truths, just the simple presence of two people who had weathered loss and expectation, now standing on common ground. He reached for the thermos he always carried, poured tea into the lid, and handed it to her first, as if it were their unspoken ritual. Their fingers brushed, lingered, and this time neither pulled away. "It looks beautiful," Emily said, nodding toward the fountain. Though her eyes stayed on him, "We make a good team," he replied, his voice carrying more than one meaning. She smiled, quiet but certain. "Yes, we do." For a moment, they stood side by side, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the garden, and in that silence, Michael slipped his hand into hers. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it was deliberate, steady, the kind of choice that spoke louder than words. "Daddy!" Miss Emily. Sophie's voice rang out bright and insistent. She was waving at them from a bench, where another volunteer held up a camera. "Come and take a family picture with me, please." Michael chuckled, a sound full of warmth, and glanced at Emily. "She doesn't ask small things." "Does she?" Emily's throat tightened, but her smile grew. Some things are worth saying yes to. They walked hand in hand to where Sophie was waiting, her little arms already stretching wide to pull them close. The three of them sat together by the fountain. Sophie squeezed between them, beaming as the camera clicked. It was nothing grand. No staged portrait or corporate announcement. Just a girl, her father, and the woman who had quietly stepped into both of their lives. As they rose, Sophie tugged at their joined hands. "Now it's official," she declared with a seriousness only a child could carry. "We're a team." Michael bent down, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Emily leaned in, too, her heart catching at how natural it felt. How right. From a rainy evening in a grocery store to the sunlit garden, the path between them had been anything but simple. And yet, like the fountain now bubbling steadily behind them, what they had built felt lasting. No contracts, no speeches, just the quiet truth that somewhere between kindness and courage, between broken dreams and second chances, a family had begun. The foundations, Michael thought, had taken time to set, but like any strong structure, that was what made them endure. And as Sophie's laughter echoed through the garden, he knew with certainty they weren't just building Hearthlight. They were building home. In a rain-soaked Portland grocery store, Emily Thompson, a polished CEO, stood humiliated as her card was declined, the weight of stranger stares pressing against her. Yet in that vulnerable moment, Michael Davis, a single dad with a modest life and a heart shaped by loss, stepped forward with his daughter, Sophie, to pay for her groceries. His quiet act of kindness, untainted by expectation, wasn't just a transaction. It was a lifeline that pierced Emily's guarded world. Their paths crossed again in a community garden where Michael's vision for spaces that nurture lives reignited her fading passion for her Hearthlight project. Through Sophie's crayon-drawn dreams and Michael's steady presence, Emily learned that true connection transcends titles and wealth. The story teaches us a profound lesson. The smallest acts of compassion can build enduring foundations in a world quick to judge. Michael's choice to see Emily's humanity over her status reminds us that kindness is a bridge across divides of wealth, grief, or isolation. It's not about grand gestures, but about showing up as Michael did for Emily, or as Emily did for Sophie's dreams, proving that vulnerability and trust can transform lives. Their journey from a rainy checkout line to a sunlit garden, hand in hand with Sophie, shows that love and family can bloom from broken moments when we choose to see and be seen. If this story stirred your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Has a stranger's kindness ever changed your day or your life? Tell us where you're watching from and if you believe in second chances. For more stories of courage, connection, and hope, hit subscribe now. Your support keeps these heartfelt tales alive.